for Reason and Justice. And Emily will now present her topic, Protecting Our Kids, How Sex Offender Laws Are Failing Us. Is also the title of her new book.
Thank you. I don't need that. Mike? All right, can everybody hear me? Mary, please, can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. Oh. Okay. Hold on. All right. All right. Fine. If you can't hear me, just let me know. If it's echoing, is that okay? It's not echoing too much? Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you to the RSOL organizers. This is the best conference I've ever been to in my life. And this means a lot coming from me because I'm a sociologist, so I go to a lot of conferences all the time. It's one of the most important things you do as a sociologist. You go to conferences and you present your research, but I've never been to a conference where I've talked to more people or I felt more welcome or I've learned more. And it's like a huge relief for me because as he just mentioned, I have this book out, right? It's called Protecting Our Kids, How Sex Offender Laws Are Failing Us. And it's always kind of weird because I have 4 children. So often I'm in a playground with other parents or I'm with other people and I'll say I have to go, I'm working on a book, or my kids will say, oh, my mom's busy all the time, she's working on a book. So people will say, what's your book about? And I never say sex offenders, ever. And my son said, oh, my mom's going to a conference to talk about her book. So his teacher, he's in kindergarten, said, oh, what's your book about? And so I'll say things like crimes against children, because I just feel worried sometimes. So it's so nice to be here. My book's about sex offenders. I work on sex offenders. I care about sex offenders. Sex offenders are people too. So let me give you some context. So I'm doing this. I became interested in this subject. I'm a college professor, but like most college professors, I have a PhD. I got my PhD in sociology at Yale University in the late 90s. And I don't remember exactly what, technically, I think it was awarded in 2002. But I did my research in the late 90s. And my dissertation was about domestic violence. And I was very interested in women's studies and feminism. And I was very interested in the movement that made domestic violence a crime and got laws passed that were very harsh about relating to domestic violence. And so I studied something called the Domestic Violence Court, which was a specialized court part that only dealt with domestic violence cases. And I started out thinking this was a really good thing, and this was a success of a social movement, the feminist movement, that they started out as a loosely organized group of activists, and they had managed to get lots of money and lots of funding, and they got their own specialized court part in Brooklyn, New York. They got a Brooklyn Felony Domestic Violence Court. And they only saw domestic violence cases. And I thought this was like a great thing. And I wanted to go in there and see how this judge dealt with batterers, how they took this crime very seriously. And I'd kind of learned in my graduate studies that historically when women had called the police to report a domestic violence crime, they'd been told, oh, chill out, why don't you not be so hysterical? Why don't you, be a good wife? And would tell the guy to take a walk around the block. And then I'd also learned that these domestic violence courts were a response to police not taking domestic violence seriously. So I sat in that court for a year doing my research. And it was pretty clear to me very quickly that batterers, that's what they were called in the domestic violence research, were not monsters. Victims were complicated, relationships were complicated. And I saw this judge send every single person who came in there immediately to jail, all kinds of restrictions, immediate restraining orders. And I saw a lot of people who were poor, who had really bad public defenders, and I saw prosecutors whispering to judges all day long and working together, and I was really shocked. So I wrote a dissertation that was very critical of the way the courts were dealing with domestic violence, and it wasn't how I imagined social movements would end up. because when the fight against domestic violence started, it was very much like this. It was people in a room talking about how to stop violence against women, and then it wound up just being another court. If you saw the domestic violence court, it just looked like a bunch of poor people being treated poorly by the system and getting extra long sentences. They'd say, you're a domestic violence offender. If it wasn't domestic violence, you'd get 10 years. Because it's domestic violence, you get 15 years. So they get this special designation. Anyway, so that's what started me thinking critically about the criminal justice system. And then I met Jesse Friedman through my friend Debbie Nathan, who's a great journalist and a great writer, who's made a lot of people aware of the hysteria and panic surrounding sex offenses. So I met this kid named Jesse Friedman, who was my age. I met him right after I finished my dissertation. He was exactly my age, and he just spent 13 years in prison for child sexual abuse. My friend Debbie Nathan did a lot of work on his case, and it was likely the case of a wrongful conviction, but nevertheless, he was released on parole, he was not exonerated, and he was living life as a sex offender. And this was in New York City in about 2001, 2002, and he had a terrible life. He came out of prison, and he was very religious in prison. He tried to join a religious congregation in New York City. He was told he couldn't be there because he was a sex offender, which totally shocked me. I didn't know anything about sex offenders, but I thought the one place you could go if you'd made a mistake, guilty or not, was a church. The church said, get out of here. He was kicked out of his apartment building. He couldn't find a job. He became the focus, or he was the focus of an award-winning documentary called Capturing the Friedmans. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Yet he still today, so it's 2014, the documentary came out in 2002. He's been out of prison about 15 years. He's still on the sex offender registry. He's still fighting his appeal. He's a level 3 sex offender. And he and his wife can't have children. But I was really struck when I met Jesse that he was just like me, but instead of going to college when he was 18, he was sent to prison. And it really scared me that somebody just like me could be sent to prison as a result of moral panic and hysteria. So I started looking at crimes against children and sex offenders and why when people get out of prison and they finish their parole, they're still subject to these restrictions. What is it about sex offenders that makes them so different than every other offender? If Jesse murdered somebody, he could probably join a church. He could probably live in the apartment where he wanted to live. But because he'd been convicted of sexually abusing children, he was not allowed to move on and live his life and get a job and be reintegrated into the community, or even go to college. He couldn't go to college because of his sex offender status. Then I heard another story. I heard about Bernard Barron. Eric Tenen is here, who's partner of John Swamley, who's an excellent lawyer who eventually got Bernard Barron exonerated. When Bernard Barron was 17, he was a teenager. He was working at a daycare center. He was a gay teenager. Some of the parents found out that he was gay, and they complained to the director of the center, and they said they wanted him fired. The director said, we can't fire him just because he's gay. The kids really like him. And then pretty soon, these same parents accused him of touching their children. And then other parents heard this, and this panic spread. And I'm sure you're familiar with many of these daycare cases. This was one of the infamous cases. And he wound up very quickly being convicted. He was a working class kid. He didn't have a good lawyer, and spent 22 years in prison. If you want to read more about Bernard Barron's case, Judith Levine, who's on the National Center for Reason and Justice with me, who's here, wrote a really great piece about his story. He was eventually, thanks to Eric Tenen and John Swamley, released and exonerated, but he died last year. So he spent about 20 years in prison, and then he was out for 8 years. Anyway, so one thing about both these stories, I won't go too much into Jesse Friedman's story, but Jesse Friedman's story is very complicated. Jesse Friedman was innocent, in my opinion, even though he still hasn't been exonerated of sexually abusing children, but his father was a consumer of child pornography, and it's a very messy, complicated case. Jesse confessed under pressure, and so it's a mess. If you look up his case, there's a ton written on it. Bernard Barron's case is a very clean, nice case. It's a really easy story. People feel they cry when they hear his case. They're very moved by it. But what I want to talk today is about stories and cases, and there's some cases that are really easy to talk about, and some cases and stories that are really hard to talk about. But I think if you want to overturn these laws, you have to talk about all of these cases, even the ones that aren't so clean and that aren't so nice, because I think everybody punishment is okay. You can be punished, but you shouldn't be punished forever. Draconian punishment is not okay. And when you serve your time and you're punished, that's it. And sex offenders are no different. Thank you. One thing that I just wanted to mention, one thing that some of you know in criminal justice departments today and sociology departments, a really popular course, if you want to get a lot of students to register for your course, you can teach a course on serial killers. And you can do research on serial killers. And I would actually feel more comfortable telling people I went and I interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer and I learned everything about serial killers than to say that I talked to sex offenders. Because the climate is so weird and warped that it's better and more interesting, and serial killers are like a legitimate area of study. And if you go to the American Sociological Association, you'll see panels on serial killers, the American Society of Criminology. You don't see this on sex offenders. And I feel like people would be more comfortable with me and my work, and many of you, if you had an interest or knew somebody who was a serial killer. And it just shows how crazy things have become. Anyway, okay, so my book has a lot of research and data in it. So there's lots of studies out there that show us that these laws don't work. You know that recidivism rates are low, intervention works, treatment works. The registry has not caused a decrease in sex offenses. The most important date that I think in all this, the most important piece of data, is that in 1992, we started to see a decline of child sexual abuse. And that's been a steady and steep decline, and that's data from the Department of Justice, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Megan's Law went into effect in 1996. So it did not affect the decline. The decline started before. So something else started the decline. And it's been steady and steep, yet 1996, we have Megan's Law. You see the decline. 2006, the Adams-Walsh Act comes into play. These acts did not cause the decline of child sexual abuse. And that's really important. And research and data is really important because it shows the public registry doesn't work. It shows residency restrictions don't work. Recidivism is low. Most of the book has these studies. It repeats these studies. I have a chapter where I look at the data in New York State. But I think the primary tool of your fight and the most meaningful part of my book are your stories, and these personal stories. I think you can repeat the research and data all day, but it's the stories that will create social change. You have to put a face on this issue. The research is there. Before they passed Megan's Law, there was no research that showed a public registry would protect children, but they passed it anyway. There was no research then. There is very little research now. There's more. There's no research that shows this works. It's not like there's some issues where you have research that shows things work and research that shows things don't work, and there's a debate. If you look at real sex offender research, these registries are not effective. They don't work. But we have the research, and it's not what got these laws passed, and it's not what's going to get these laws changed. But in doing the book, I learned the power of these stories and that these lessons need to be heard. So is Josh Gravens here? Okay, Josh is not here, but Jennifer, Josh's friend, is here, and I'm so happy you're here because Josh, who many of you know, I invited Josh to come to my class in Brooklyn, New York, and tell his story. I teach a criminology class, and I rarely talk about sex offenders because I teach at a college where it's a college for first-generation college students. Many of them enter the police force. They want to go into law enforcement, and it's difficult to talk about sex offenders with them. But I took a risk, and I had Josh Gravens come and talk to my class about his experience being on the registry. He went on the registry when he was 14 and going to prison and spending 3 years there, and then being on the public registry for 10 years. And they were in tears. I had 35 students. I asked them to go home and blog about their experience. They all said it was the worst thing they'd ever heard. They had no idea that children could be on the registry. And this was a population, they weren't primed. I'd never talked about it. In fact, when he came, I didn't even put it on like our campus list of events because I was very frightened. I wasn't sure how they would react. They were so moved, and it showed me that I could sit up there and talk about recidivism rates all day. They would not care. In the beginning of the class, we had been talking about drug law reform, and they said people shouldn't go to prison for drugs, but there should be a prison for sex offenders. That's the one crime where there should be no reform. Yet Josh came and told his story, and they changed their minds. And that's why you have to tell these stories. And Josh's is a really clean story. It's a really good story. It's not a messy story, but messy stories work too, and I think that's really important. Josh was a juvenile offender, but all offenders are worth talking about and important to talk about. All right, so I'm going to read a couple of stories from my book, but before I do, I'm just going to give a little context for what I think brought about these laws. I mean, we're going on 30 years of sex panics. I think our approach to sex offenders falls into the context of a moral panic. This is a really long moral panic. This is a really long sex panic, and it's disturbing because I think, as I said, it's about 30 years. You can look at the 60s, and you see child molesters as kind of a joke. There was Chester the molester, who was kind of a loser, who couldn't relate to adults, who was hanging out in a park, who needed psychological help. He just couldn't relate to adults, and it was kind of a joke. You can see comics making fun of him. If you're interested in that, Philip Jenkins wrote Moral Panic, which talks about the history and the up and down responses to child molesters. Yet now, child molesters, or people we think are child molesters, and I'm including people convicted of non-contact crimes, now we have the pedophile. And the pedophile is the epitome of all evil. I'll stop mentioning people, but Judith Levine, my colleague on the National Center for Reason and Justice, wrote an amazing book about, Judith, I'm blanking on the name. Harmful to Minors, the perils of protecting children from sex. And she does the best job of showing how we moved to medicalize this condition and create this monster of the pedophile, this medical problem with no cure, this condition. One of the responses to this shift to making the sex offender the epitome of all evil is that we thought one way we can help victims is to punish abusers as harshly as possible. And this became the answer. The way we help victims heal is we put people on registries, we punish them forever, and this is going to help victims. And this was a new kind of response to this. Child sexual abuse in the 80s, and like I said, read Judith's book if you want to really learn about this, or Debbie Nathan and Michael Snedeker's book, Satan's Silence, where you see in the 1980s something happens where child sexual abuse becomes this experience which is viewed as permanently traumatic, the worst of the worst thing that can ever happen to a child. And therefore, since it's the worst thing that can ever happen to a child, anything that happens to the person accused of harming the child is okay. We know there's a lot of issues related to homophobia also present in our response to sex offenders. In the late 1970s, you saw Anita Bryant saying that gays wanted to recruit young boys and they shouldn't teach and they shouldn't adopt, and the gay rights movement was sort of helpless to fight this. So this added to the hysteria. The gay rights movement couldn't address this issue because of historical stereotypes about gay people, especially gay men. They couldn't push back against this panic. It got really out of control. So we know the research shows that these laws don't make children any safer. And the stories in my book, I'm just going to read 3 brief little stories that show how they destroy the lives of the offenders permanently, all in the name of child protection. But if I had to say there's one thing that I got from all my interviews with sex offenders, people on the registry, is the sense of fear, the sense of shame, how they feel alone, how their friends and family left them, how people didn't stand by them, and how they would often minimize their crimes, even to me, when I don't care. You know, I don't care what they did. I want to see what's happening to them and how we can change these laws. And I think it's really important to tell your stories, and that's okay. It's the laws that are destructive, and it's the response to these crimes that is destructive. Everybody knows that in the United States, we punish people enough. We don't have to worry. People go to prison for a long time, but when they get out and they're off parole or they're off probation, they should be able to make lives for themselves. And that's what's wrong, not what mistakes or crimes occurred. All right, so I'm just going to read a couple of stories here. I'm going to read the story of somebody I'll call Brad. And this is kind of a messy story. Brad was 30, and he had a sexual relationship with a 13-year-old that he met online. It's not a Romeo and Juliet case. It's not, a juvenile offender. he was in his 30s, and he met a 13-year-old online, and he had sex with him. He says he wasn't especially interested in children, but he went ahead and arranged to meet the boy after they chatted online. At that time, Brad was a pastor and in denial about his homosexuality, and the case received major media attention because he was a pastor. He spent 5 years in prison. Brad's been out for 20 years. He's never been rearrested. He said he was kind of relieved when he was caught because he could finally be open about his sexuality. And he was finally freed from the confusion and guilt he'd experienced as a closeted gay man throughout his life. During his court hearing, Brad says therapists testified that he felt tremendous guilt about the incident and affirmed that he had a low risk of reoffending. He says that the child involved admitted he was interested in meeting adult men. Indeed, they'd met on an adult chat site, and the boy had been seeking out men. And there was also evidence that Brad was not the first adult he'd had a sexual relationship with. The victim wrote Brad a letter saying he was sorry that Brad had to go to prison. Brad felt so terrible, even when he was with the boy, that there was evidence that he called the therapist from the hotel during the incident, saying he felt terrible and what could he do. He said, "I did a terrible thing. I was mortified. It was horrible and shameful. I was so embarrassed. It was a horrible thing." Brad wants to move on with his life, and more than anything, to be forgiven and humanized and accepted. Brad believes he deserved to go to prison. He knows he did something terrible and accepts his punishment. The problem, he says, is that he's now solely defined as a sex offender, and he can never reform and never be a better person because he's on the registry. His picture's on the registry. Everybody knows he's on the registry. One way he's tried to rehabilitate himself is he, for a while, tried to do interviews and media appearances about what he did. He did some even while he was incarcerated. He used his own story as an example of the dangers of the internet, how it can facilitate sex between adults and children. He continues to try to be as public and outspoken as possible in his efforts to educate parents about what their children might be doing online. Brad repeats to me over and over that he has no defense for his actions and the child, for his actions with the child, that it was wrong, and that he understands why others cannot even comprehend what he did. Nevertheless, Brad says he's changed, he's grown, he would never offend again. He's never been rearrested. He feels that living on the registry is a nightmare and that these regulations make him feel less than human. In the state where he lives, some politicians have argued that sex offenders should not have the right to vote because some voting sites are at schools. This is ludicrous, he says. How can we molest children on voting day when schools are closed? He says his life is meaningless and unduly governed by pointless, politically motivated rules. I'm not pro-sex offender, he says. I'm pro-move on with your life, even if you've made a mistake and committed a crime. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Gosh, I'm sorry. Sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay. Sorry. Okay. He says, I'm not pro-sex offender. I'm pro-move on with your life, even if you've made a mistake and committed a crime. People make mistakes. People change and get better, but we don't give that benefit to a sex offender. Brad never complains about being in prison or being on parole. But I want to go beyond my crime and not get defined by the registry. He's gotten fired many, many times. He's been homeless. Once when he was homeless, he wasn't allowed in the local homeless shelter because he was a sex offender. His relatives said they'd let him move in with them, but their children attend schools where they post the photographs of all nearby sex offenders, and Brad does not want his nephews to suffer the humiliation of seeing his picture on the wall of their school. Brad will be on the registry for life. Sometimes he says, I wish I could die saving a child. That way I'd be forgiven. Okay, so that is one story. So I'm going to read, let me see what I'm doing. Okay, all right, I'm going to read another story now. But I think one thing that, like I said, I think Brad is not a Romeo and Juliet case. He did a terrible thing. He was 30. He was with a 13-year-old. He accepts his punishment. I can tell he's been to lots of treatment because he says over and over and over, I did a terrible thing, I'm sorry. He uses the language of therapy. I've not been rearrested. I do everything right, but my picture's there. It says my victim was 13. It says I was in my 30s. Nobody will hire me or let me do anything. Okay, so this story is about Daniel. Daniel was the first person I interviewed. Daniel's a sex offender. He was happily married with a young daughter when he engaged in an online chat with a police officer posing as a 14-year-old. He served 3 years in prison and is now released and on the sex offender registry for life. Daniel says he loved his wife, but he would often spend time on adult chat sites. His wife left Daniel immediately after his arrest. Daniel had met many women online, but he'd never had the nerve to go through with an affair. On this occasion, he says, he was on a site called Adult Friend Finder, and the woman he was writing asked him to leave the site and meet her on a general chat site. Daniel did, and when they left, she told him she was 14. He continued to talk to her and told her he was 33. Daniel says he was flattered and surprised that a 14-year-old wanted to meet him, so he didn't end the conversation immediately. As in other cases that I wrote about, I learned that if an adult continues a conversation with a minor after she discloses or a decoy discloses that they are underage, they are subject to arrest. A transcript of the conversation shows that they never made specific plans to meet and that the exchanges were all between 1 and 5 words. He asked her to send a picture, and once she did, he realized she was not a 14-year-old but an undercover officer. He immediately called the police and turned himself in. His parents helped him while he was in prison, and now that he is out, he lives alone in an extended stay residence hotel. He cannot find a job that pays what he used to because of the difficulty of finding a job as a sex offender, and he's behind on child support. The worst part is the stigma and the embarrassment. The police sometimes come to his room unannounced and raid his belongings. He can't see his daughter without his ex-wife present, and she is happily remarried. His ex-wife meets him with his daughter at a mall around once a month, but he misses feeling like a father. I just want to provide for my family, he says, and I can't do that. I can't even be alone with my daughter. His daughter is close to her new stepfather, and Daniel feels excluded and alone. He is being treated for depression after expressing suicidal thoughts to his therapist. I don't even understand, he says, why they let me out of prison. I feel like I am continually being punished, and there is no hope. Daniel is experiencing what Roger Lancaster, who is also on the board of the National Center for Reason and Justice and is a great cultural studies theorist, calls social death. He exists, he lives in this residence hotel, he gets odd jobs here and there, but he can't have a life. He has to be in by 8, he's dating a woman, but he has to be in his room by 8, so he can't really have much of a relationship with her. He tells his story, and employers express sympathy, but they can't take a chance and hire him because he's on the registry as having a 14-year-old victim. So he's isolated, he's alone, and very, very sad. Yet at the same time, I was inspired by his willingness. He met me at a conference, and he let me interview him, and he wants to help and do something to change these laws, but he's not sure what to do. In his state, they don't have an active group like Texas Voices. He can't afford to come to this conference. I don't even think he can leave the state, actually. But the point is he wants to tell his story so that something will change. All right. I'm going to tell one more story. And many of the people I interviewed, many thanks to Mary Sue Molnar, who's here, who's an amazing contact. She just stepped out for a minute, but anyway. Mary Sue introduced me to lots of people who are willing to talk to me, but one of the things I noticed, a lot of the people who talked to me were wives and mothers, because many offenders themselves didn't feel comfortable talking, and many of the greatest advocates are family members of people on the registry, because it's hard when you yourself are on the registry to feel open and want to talk about this. One man I talked to, his son is on the registry, and he said, my wife and my son don't want me to do this. They don't want me to go to conferences. They don't want me to be an activist. They just want me to keep my mouth shut because everything is just going to be worse. They're all traumatized by the experience, and they don't feel proud or happy that their husband and father is out there talking about this. But nevertheless, he does. All right, so this is the story of a wife of somebody who's a level 3 sex offender. Michelle is married to a man who is currently appealing his conviction for sexually abusing a child under 17. Her husband's on the sex offender registry, listed as a level 3 offender, and although he's had some victories in his lengthy appeals process, and some journalists have even written about his conviction and suggested he's innocent, these debates are understandably not reflected in his registry posting. All you see is that he had multiple victims under the age of 12. Michelle remembers watching as a man approached her husband in front of their home yelling, "Fucking child molester." Michelle was brokenhearted when she saw her husband remove his glasses because he assumed he was about to get punched in the face by the furious man. Her husband had learned during his 15 years in prison that being punched when you're wearing your glasses makes it worse. In this instance, the police arrived before the man could assault her husband, but Michelle says incidents like this are a source of constant fear for them. Michelle says her friends tell her she should try to go talk to her neighbors, tell them their story, tell them her husband's never been rearrested, that he's rehabilitated, that he's a good person, that she loves him. But she worries that approaching them might be seen as antagonistic, and they might be frightened. We try to stay as invisible and small as possible, she says. She says the regular harassment they experience because of her husband being on the public registry fills them with a constant state of dread. Michelle believes that her husband is innocent, but she also has great sympathy for anyone on the registry, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Nothing about these restrictions, she says, makes anyone safer. In fact, she says, these restrictions are explosive and dangerous because the restrictions, by virtue of their design, have the effect of breaking people. Michelle says the registry has effectively put them in a state of exile because they cannot interact or connect with others in any kind of normal way. They have few friends because the public registry makes it exceptionally easy for people to learn that her husband is a sex offender. They just Google him in her state. The first thing that comes up is his registry listing. And she says few people want to be around them out of fear of guilt by association. I know, Michelle says, what these laws have done to me psychologically. I live my life in fear, as does my husband. I don't even remember what feeling safe feels like. Okay, so if you're interested, there's more stories, which I won't read. You guys have similar stories. One thing I want to comment on is recently, so my book came out about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, and I entered the public debate about these issues a little bit in the wake of the Josh Duggar case. When I read about the Josh Duggar case, I was horrified when I saw the reactions. I don't know much about the Duggars. I'm not like a fan of the show or the family or anything. I'm not a fan, I just had never thought about them. But I was shocked, and so one night I started reading, there was like a Facebook page about the story, and there was like 10,711 comments. And I think I read every single comment, and they were horrible. And it also showed me how this is not a political issue. People said, they are not pro-gay marriage, these people are evil. This shows that people who aren't gay marriage are even more perverted and disgusting than others. And then on the right, Mike Huckabee wrote like a piece in favor of them, which was very surprising. But then everybody said, you lost our vote. We thought you were a good, God-fearing person. And it was just crazy, the things people said. I was totally horrified because I thought I thought because of the nature of the family, some people would be sympathetic. Nobody was sympathetic. People said, he's a pedophile. He has daughters. I worry for his daughters. He should have been in prison. This is sick that he didn't go to prison. He was 14 when he touched 4 of his sisters and a family friend. The daggers came out, the pitchforks came out. What people said about this case was so horrifying. I'm sure many of you saw it. So I wrote what I thought was a somewhat mild editorial saying, well, okay, he did something wrong, should have been punished, but having spent the last couple of years talking to sex offenders who did go to therapy and did do the right thing, I kind of understand why the parents didn't go to therapists or mandated reporters and didn't go to the police. Not excusing the behavior, but just saying that these laws are so crazy that people have nowhere to turn. And I kind of understand why the parents tried to deal with it themselves. Then I got lots of accusations that people feel bad for my own children because I might be molesting them. And, yeah. And my children totally agreed. They were like, yes, she's a terrible person. But people said terrible things, right? And who is this person? She just wants grant money because there's tons of grant money when you study sex offenders. And then I got a call to go on Fox News, and I got to go on Fox News and talk to Megyn Kelly about this. And it was kind of interesting, though. But I think it really shows the power of stories because I don't think Megyn Kelly or Fox News really cares about sex offenders, but they did care about this family. They like this family. For whatever reason, she was clearly a fan of this family. So it was like somebody she knew, somebody she liked, somebody she respected was being thrown under the bus like this and being talked about like this. And she said, he was a minor, his parents dealt with it. They went to their church. Who are we to say anything? So I went on there and I tried, she kind of cut me off, but I tried to say, look, you're right. It was probably better they didn't go to the police, but there's lots of, juvenile offenders in general have low recidivism rates, and then I got it in there, but then she cut me off. I said, all sex offenders have low recidivism rate, and all these laws are crazy. But one thing I realized is that she really liked this story, but she didn't really want to hear any other stories. But we've got to work to get all of these stories out there and not just find, the easy stories. And it's kind of interesting because all of these laws came out because the media loves to amplify the worst examples. The media loves the worst stories. If you look, Megan's Law came out because a terrible story was told over and over and over and over again. Everybody knows the story of Megan Kenka. And so the media amplifies the worst examples to make monsters, and they create monsters for the public, but at the same time, they're only willing to kind of focus on the easiest stories, the Romeo and Juliet cases, or juvenile offenders. And it worries me, and it's something that RSOL and other organizations and organizers have to think about. If you say, okay, well, juvenile offenders shouldn't be on the registry, are you throwing everybody else under the bus, or is it a step in the right direction and then you can move to others? And it's a tough question. But the media so easily takes these horrible cases and creates monsters in the public mind. But they're really reluctant to look at anything other than the most sympathetic stories and the most, sort of extreme examples of lives that are wrecked. But anyway, so in conclusion, working on this made me think a lot about storytelling. If you're interested in the research and studies, I put them all in here. There's a lot of research and studies. There's a lot of good people doing research. There's a lot of data that shows these laws aren't what protect children. You guys all know the statistic, right? Over 90% of children are sexually abused by people they know. These laws are not going to help those people. Most people who are arrested don't have records of prior records for sexually abusing children, so the registries are not helping. If you really care about kids, you've got to do something else. They're emotional, they appeal to something in us, they make us feel good, but they don't do anything. So I don't think you should talk about sex offenders, because sex offenders are monsters, but the stories you tell are human stories. They're painful. They're stories of mistakes and crimes and flawed people. We can't challenge the specter of the sex offender, but we can tell these stories and then use the research and data and evidence to show these stories aren't exceptions, but the rule. I want to end on kind of an upbeat note. There's been a lot more research and writing in recent years about this. When I first started researching this, many of you might have noticed that some of the best work was done in law reviews by lawyers and people dealing with these mandatory minimums and the insanity in the courts. And now social science is catching up to this. It's so exciting to see the growing organizing here. I know this is you have the greatest attendance at this conference that you've ever had, right? And even if your stories are messy and difficult, don't be ashamed. Tell the truth. Don't minimize, because if you talk to journalists and you minimize, it's going to backfire. That's what's going to bring criminal justice reform. I've seen it in other movements. You can even see, like, with Caitlyn Jenner, right? Nobody really cared about that issue, but now people care because there's a story and there's a person. In the abstract, nobody cares about these issues. And don't leave out child pornography offenders. They're getting the longest sentences. I've talked to so many people here who have people in their family convicted of these offenses. And it's okay to talk about the research and talk about these cases. Don't avoid them. Don't say, well, they're different. They're the real monsters. My son was 19 and his girlfriend was 16. I think that's a problem, and I think that's wrong. Anyone caught up in excessive punishment and lifetime punishment should be defended, not just people we like, even Josh Duggar. Stand together. When you're in a group, you have power, and you should keep fighting. And thank you so much for helping me and telling me your stories, even when you didn't know anything about me. Your stories are critical. From my knowledge as a professional sociologist about moral panics, your stories are what will change these laws. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love to take some questions. Thank you so much.
Emily asked me to go ahead and just
if you want to,
really quickly. She obviously has an awesome book here with tons of resources. We do have some copies here. They're for sale today for $37, and since she is here, I think she'd be willing to autograph any copies that are purchased today. So anyway, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yes?
And she can't sell them for less than what Amazon does. Because of her contract.
Right, I would. Thank you, Mary Sue.
Somebody said they ordered them, they tried to order one online and they were out of them.
Yeah, I think my publisher didn't think anyone was going to buy it, so I think she had like 10, yeah, so it was sold out, but not because I sold 10,000 or anything like that. Yeah.
So, the initial response to the Duggar story was a lot of vitriol.
Yes.
After that special that Fox did, and you're part of that, was there any comeback from that, or was there any softening of the response?
I'm going to ask my friend Bill Dobbs. What do you think, Bill? Because Bill's...
I think Emily's intervention helped to open up another way to think about the case. It needed to be said that the Duggars were boxed in a corner, but the overreaction is fascinating because it had happened so many years previously. And while it was out in the public arena, it kept getting kicked for so many different odd, which Emily was talking about, so many odd political ways. And she helped to bring it back to, well, what should we actually do in a situation like this? They handle it inside their family. So I'd say, yes, it opened up, even though there were some brickbats thrown, it did open up some other ways to think about familial child abuse like that.
John?
Coming from Arkansas, a little context may be helpful. The patriarch, Jim Bob Duggar, was, for several terms, one of our United States congressmen. And northwestern Arkansas is kind of unique in that it is a very, very strong area of what could be called near or absolute fundamentalist Christianity. And a lot of the talk that was going on in Arkansas, one group were saying with 19 kids and counting, Josh Duggar never even kissing his fiancée before they married. That is such a great exercise of faith. And then it comes out and, oh my God, those GD hypocrites. So you have a lot of that going on in Arkansas as well. And then again, there were more than a few people that I talked to and said, well, even these celebrities, even these Arkansas celebrities, oh, how the mighty have fallen. And quite a number of them were kind of smug about that. Look at what happened to them, and I think the implication is, look at what happened to them, and I'll never be a part of anything like that. Nothing like that's ever going to happen to me.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, I've gotten through, I don't know, the first 30 pages or so of your book. Could you talk a little bit about your discussion of, kind of philosophically what was happening in each of the decades? And, can you just give us a brief overview of that?
Well, I think I start out talking about the first federal child abuse legislation, because there wasn't even child abuse, physical child abuse wasn't even addressed. There weren't laws, there wasn't data. And the first child abuse legislation, which I think is really interesting, because when the federal government first wanted to deal with child abuse, they had this woman testify, Jolly Kay. And I talk about her because she's kind of emblematic of how our perspective on crime and punishment and children has changed. Jolly Kay was this woman who came forward and she said, I beat my child. I was a child abuser. But I got self-help. I went to a group. I formed a group called Parents Anonymous. And I got help. And I learned how to stop beating my child. And she testified before Congress. And both the Republicans and Democrats loved this. They said, oh my gosh, we don't have to have any funding for this. Parents can just organize and talk about how to stop abusing their child. And she talked in very brutal terms. You can see the congressional testimony online. She threw a knife at her child. She choked her child. She made her child eat dirt off the floor. Terrible things. But through her confession, she pulled herself up by her bootstraps and she kind of stopped doing this. So Congress passed this federal law that kind of funded these self-help groups, but it really didn't focus on punishment and jail and registries today, right? You hear talk of child abuse registries, and people were kind of okay, people can change, people can get better, and it was kind of an optimistic moment. It was the last moment of the Great Society. But you also heard people at that hearing, somebody stood up and said, well, isn't child abuse related to poverty? And they said, no, this is not a poverty problem. This is really just about bad parents. So at the same time, you saw the child abuser kind of emerge as an evil person, a bad person, and people liked the image of somebody being evil, but they also were willing to say, oh, you could change, and government doesn't have to just, have a criminal justice response. So it was more a social kind of service response therapy. Originally, people thought even extreme physical batterers in the 60s just needed kind of therapy. They didn't need punishment and prison and incarceration, that there were other ways to deal with this. These people were under stress. She said parents are under stress. Sometimes you hit your kid when you're stressed out. Now you couldn't say that, right? Now, Parents Anonymous is very different today. If you went and you'd be mandated to report it, right? But it was a very different time.
What year was that?
1974 is when she testified. But she was like on 60 Minutes, and everybody thought she wound up killing herself, but everybody said that she was like this icon of change. You could be really brutal to a child, and you could do a terrible thing, but you could change, and nobody talked about taking her kids away or anything. Her kids were all with her, yeah.
Questions? Any other questions?
Wait, let me take...
I've talked to some people who believe that a step towards recognizing things such as pedophilia as an addiction would be a major step. Have you done any research in that? Are you aware of research and what the findings are that might emerge?
I'm going to call in Judith Levine, who is probably the expert on this subject.
First, number one, I think people think there are many more people who are pedophiles than are. A compulsive and exclusive desire for prepubescent children is very rare. Even people with incest are often married and have other adult relationships and so on. And sometimes they're crime of convenience. There's your wife's daughter, So I generally don't like to think, the language of addiction to me has a lot of problems. There is such a thing as being, physically in need of a particular drug, let's say. I mean, that really does happen in people's physiology. Whereas, people who have pedophilic desires can learn to not act on them. If they were truly addicted, as they were, to heroin or something, then that would be, So that's just my own, I don't like that metaphor really. I think it's way overused, and I think it also, it has the same effect of this idea that you're incurable, that you're never going to be able, And furthermore, you have to be abstinent from all sex, probably, in order to, because you're going to turn on and you're going to go do this bad thing, which, there's no research really that shows that happens. So I don't think it would be very positive, in my opinion.
Okay, Gail?
Well, first of all, to be very clear, pedophilia is not addiction. Pedophilia is a clinical diagnosis, and it is the same, as you would look at depression being a clinical diagnosis. There are people that are diagnosed with depression that are suicidal. There are people that are diagnosed with depression that are not suicidal. There are people that are diagnosed as pedophiles or pedophilia that are never going to act upon it because they have impulse control. So just because you have a pedophilic diagnosis, it doesn't mean you're going to act upon it. So just like with depression and someone being suicidal, there are pedophiles that will never touch a child.
Hey, thanks, Gail. And then, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on that because we got to be careful with the terms that we're using. Unfortunately, the media is putting pedophiles and sex offenders in one word in the same sentence, and that is not the case at all. And as Professor says, pedophilia is a mental health disorder. It's a diagnosis, and there are different types of pedophiles. There are regressed pedophiles that are able to have sexual relationships with age-appropriate, and there are the so-called fixated pedophiles, and those are the ones that are getting often children exclusively, or are attracted to children exclusively. But that does not mean that they automatically are offenders. And so we've got to be really careful with that. And as far as sexual addiction goes, that can, for instance, be a sexual offense can be the culmination of a whole long string of sexual addiction. I mean, point in case maybe child pornography, where somebody starts with regular penis vagina porn, and if that is addictive, gets addictive and compulsive for someone, then they're chasing the high. So then it gets to the next level, to the next level, to the next level, and they may find themselves in offending behavior, such as watching child pornography, or even going a step further. And that could be the result. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and unfortunately, in mandated treatment, that's not looked at. Because sex addiction is not in the DSM, so therefore it doesn't exist, but it actually does. And I speak from experience as a client, but also as an experience as a clinician, because I treat sex addicts. So, and I've seen things like that happening over and over again.
2 points. I really like when you encouraged us to not go through the my crime is not as bad as. I like that. Our crimes are all different. Well, not mine, but
Right, you're like a saint, but everybody else, yeah.
crimes are all different. The registry is the same, and that's what we're here for. I wanted to ask a question. Early in your thing, you said something about America has a problem with sex offenders. And I thought, yeah, of course they do. But I wonder, does America have a problem with sex?
Yeah. I think so. I think definitely that's the real issue. But that's really hard to talk about. And that's where really the daggers will come out if you start talking about things like age of consent and sex education, and it's so politicized and it's so charged. But I think it is a problem with sex and the extent of harm that these behaviors or actions, I mean, even the research on child pornography, we don't know the harm it causes, but even trying to research child pornography is impossible because of the panic and hysteria surrounding sex. So nobody even really knows what this specter of child pornography is, at least not for 20 years. I mean, journalists and researchers can't look it up, right? And if they do, that's a problem. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I know in Germany they have PSAs, public service announcement type ads. They talk about sex offending. It limits that, points toward that. I've seen that before personally. That's a step that would probably never happen here in this country.
Right.
Addressing it in public.
Right. Wait, I'm going to call on her and then, yeah.
So are there other countries where they actually do research? We can't do it here. Like, can we go to Germany and do research? Or
I don't know if other countries let you research child pornography. I know that in Canada, people were very angry when there was a government-funded researcher researching child pornography, and there was debate. He managed to do it, I think, but it's very hard to get funded to do the kind of quantitative studies. In fact, like in child pornography, the best studies are done by lawyers, and a bunch of federal judges got together and signed a statement against these mandatory minimums. But that came from like the legal realm. Researching, I don't know, maybe if anyone knows of other countries you can research.
Sorry.
Okay, but wait, okay, yeah, okay, yeah, sorry, yeah.
The child pornography research, the researcher you want to follow up is Michael Cito. He's the preeminent researcher on child pornography. He's out of Canada. The project that this gentleman was speaking about is the Dunkelfeld project, and they are evaluating those findings right now, and I think they're going to be released at the ATSA conference in Montreal in October. What he's talking about is they did PSAs, one of which was like a TV spot, it was a commercial. They showed it to us 2 years ago or 3 years ago at the ATSA conference, and we had subtitles, but basically they showed a man on a train, and there was a woman with a little boy, and you see this man kind of looking over at this child, and there's a voiceover, and it says, if you're having inappropriate thoughts about this child, don't have to call us. We can help. I mean, how civilized, right? So they're looking at the findings. They said that they had a tremendous response and that they've been doing good work, so we're waiting to see the findings of that.
Right, but one thing, other countries don't have public registries, so the need for research there is very different, and they don't have mandatory reporting, so you can get help. And if you are caught, your life is not necessarily destroyed, so there's probably a different impulse to do research, right? We're the ones that are dealing with these laws, but you're right, maybe you could go and spend 2 years in another country and do some more interesting research. All right, any other, yeah?
I watched you on Fox News and I cried. You were so moving, and I thought, finally, because I can follow this on all the newspaper news and excoriating the government crew, and it was disgusting to see. And I thought, give her more time.
I know that's what the producer was thinking. We need to have her on more. Yeah.
You're a little light shining, and I thought, thank you for your bravery.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
So just let me say, I'd like to say if we had more people like Emily and Judith Levine and people like and Bill Taylor, people who are not registered and don't have someone on the registry, I mean, that would be amazing. So these folks are like, they are our shining light.
There are blessings.
Yeah, they are blessings. Appreciate y'all very much.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm so moved. I really feel so welcome here, and I think this is such a great conference, and the work you do is so inspiring. And while it's true, it's good for people that don't have family members and are not registrants to do this. It's still even more fearless if you are a registrant or a family member to do this. So you guys are taking a lot of risks, so thank you. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, and I'll see everyone tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Well, did you recognize all those stories?